Hello everyone, I'm Bo from Brutal Commentary, and today I have a special video in mind today. With no more fights to really break down for the remainder of the year, as I said, I am not doing Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua. I just don't have it in me to cover a Jake Paul fight, I'm sorry. And I don't really know if I really wanted to cover the Andrew Tate boxing match that's going to happen also this Saturday, on the 20th, or sorry, December 20th. So instead, I figure I'd do a bit of a recap of the year, if you will. I planned on this video for a little bit ago, as I thought it could be a bit fun, and I figured just give out my personal opinion. So this is going to be my ranking of all 13 pay-per-views used in the UFC of 2025. So the way I ranked them was pretty simple. I have a or I don't want to call it a 3-point system, if you will. One, the overall hype and anticipation. How excited were people for this card? And then once the card aired, did it live up to expectation, exceeded it, or pretty disappointing? That's basically the main thing for hype. Number two, the quality of the fights. Now, I don't need every single fight to end in the finish, though if that happened, that was amazing. But just in general, fun fights. Like really two guys going after it, fun grappling, fun striking, just like overall majority of the fights. Like I don't need all of them to be super exciting in order to rank high on this list, but just in general, most of the fights that are on the card, 13 or 14 or otherwise, are more exciting than they were boring. And then number three, the overall impact. Now, what I mean is not necessarily what impact it had it on. Sorry, what I mean impact. I don't necessarily mean what each fight's impact their division, though, because most of these were title fights, number one contender fights, etc. So most of them had a major impact on their divisions. Now, some more than others, obviously, but overall, like the impact it had in like the MMA community, how we viewed the fighters who won and or lost on this card, and just overall the if it's a card you remember, that's the best way to put it for me on impact. Like, man, I'm going to remember this card for years. It's one of the best cards I've ever seen. Or 6 months later, you're struggling to remember some of the fights that took place on a different card. That's essentially what I mean. Also, throughout this, I'm also going to do a video of my top 10 knockouts and top 10 fights of the year as well. Last but not least, I've actually reached 50 subscribers, so that's an awesome step up for the channel. So next week, I'm actually going to try a live stream. I'll figure out the logistics of that as I go about it and make sure I can actually do it properly. But I do plan on live streaming next week, and I'll release a post later on what day it is and what time. But without further ado, let's get down to the rankings. So at number 13, or the bottom of the barrel, I have UFC 312 du Plessis versus Strickland 2. Honestly, number 13 and number 12 were pretty interchangeable. And I'll get to number 12 in a minute. But in general, I thought both cards really struggled. Their main events were kind of boring. Well, one was more disappointing than the other for a different reason. But for looking at UFC 312, the hype on this card was not that great in general. Honestly, you look at the other three cards for February, Song Yadong versus Henry Cejudo, Jared Cannonier versus Gregory Rodriguez, and Israel Adesanya versus Nasruddin Imavov. Those on paper seemed like much more exciting cards and had much more exciting fights than what UFC 312 was going to deliver for us. Now, the overall hype and anticipation wasn't that great. I think, honestly, most people were excited for the co-main event because, watching Zhang Weili fight is always entertaining. And seeing her against the undefeated Tatiana Suarez was an intriguing thing. But I know most people weren't excited about the rematch between Strickland and du Plessis, mostly because I know most people wanted to see Hamzat versus du Plessis. And overall, you look at some of the fights on the main card, right? Jake Matthews versus Francisco Prado, Jimmy Crute versus Rodolfo Bellato. I mean, fucking Taliesin Teixeira versus Justin Tafa as your featured fight. Yeah, no, those three fights belong on prelims on a pay-per-view. A main card, at least for a fight night, not the featured fight of a pay-per-view you're paying money for. Now, thankfully we don't really have the pay-per-view format anymore coming in next year, but still. Now, for some of my issues, there were some so fun fights on this card. The Gabriel Santos versus Jack Jenkins fight was a really fun fight between featherweight prospects. Tom Nolan versus Vyacheslav Borshev was an exciting striking match throughout. The debut of Alexandre Topuria, that was probably the biggest thing on the card, watching the brother of Topuria. But there were some fun fights too. Quinlan Salkill destroying Ashmel Jubilee was a treat to watch, a 19-second knockout. And Rong Ju versus Cody Steele was a fun rock'em sock'em robots type fight where they were just swinging at each other. But overall, I just couldn't help but feel disappointed in some of the fights, like Wong Kong versus Bruno Brazil was kind of boring. Jimmy Crute versus Rodolfo Bellato, fun at times, but they both slowed down to the second and third round and got kind of boring as well. And then the main event, Duplessis versus Strickland. At the end of the day, just felt kind of disappointing because you thought maybe Strickland had learned his lesson, but really it was just 5 more rounds of the exact same fight they had last year. So overall, you think of the disappointment of the title shot. Not all these fights on paper seemed that exciting. More importantly, their card placement just seemed ridiculous. And I understand, high taxes in Australia, that is something that deters fighters, but still, the UFC couldn't have tried to put in some more ranked contenders. I mean, literally, besides the championship fight, there were no ranked contenders on this card whatsoever. So overall, I think that's the biggest reason I have it at my least favorite card of the year. Now, number 12, UFC 321, Aspinall versus Gane. The biggest reason this is not the bottom of the barrel for me is because I thought this card had a bit more exciting fights and a bit more exciting highlights than UFC 321. Now, the hype and anticipation for this card was, I thought, pretty exciting because you had the 2 best heavyweights since John Jones retired, Tom Aspinall and Cyril Gane, fighting for the heavyweight strap. Now Aspinall became the undisputed champion, unfortunately because of John Jones retiring and vacating the belt. So that left a bit of a stain on it, but you basically had 2 of Europe's best heavyweights go after it for a chance to prove that they are now the king and set a new era in the division. In the co-main event, you had Verna Jandiroba versus Mackenzie Dern, a fight not many people were excited for, but Zhang Weili vacated the belt to chase double champion glory, and these were the 2 most likely fighters to fight for the belt. And overall, some of the matchups on this card were exciting. Umar Nurmagomedov returning, Azamat Murzakanov versus Alexander Rakic. I mean, Quinlan, and then you look at some of the prelims, there were some fun matchups that you could get excited for. Ludovic Klein versus Mateusz Rebecki was a fighter fight on paper, and in practice it was. Quinlan Salkill versus Nasrat Haqparast. While a bit concerning seeing a prospect like Salkill get such a big step up in competition, seeing the performance and the head kick was spectacular. Overall, the anticipation was a bit more higher than UFC 312. And on execution, though, that's, I think, the biggest reason this is the second worst card in my opinion. Now, looking at the overall prelims, the first 3 fights were utterly boring to me. Mish Raposo versus Azat Maxim. It had its moments, but what was the most exciting thing of these first 3 fights besides Chris Barnett mooning the crowd? That was the only thing that I could really remember of those 3 fights, unfortunately. And I really want to erase that from my memory. But then it started to pick up. Nathaniel Wood versus Jose Delgado. That was such a technical masterclass of fighting between those 2. And it really shows the level of skill between the lower weight classes and the higher weight classes. And then, like I said, Ludovic Klein versus Mateusz Rebecki, amazing fight. Absolutely amazing fight. And then seeing Klein get his hand raised while having to sit on a stool because his ankle broke, that's just such an MMA thing to happen, and it was enjoyable. Walter Walker getting another heel hook was absolutely exciting. Seeing someone who actually is pretty fucking entertaining in the heavyweight division. And then the Quinlan Salkill head kick knockout. I mean, that's a knockout of the year contender right there. And the fact that he did it against such a well-established veteran just shows how good of a prospect he really is, and someone to look out for in this lightweight division for sure. And then you look at the main card. It started off great. Azamat Murzakanov knocking out Alexander Rakic was a great way to start this card. But boy, did the quality go down significantly. I mean, Alexander Volkov versus Jailton Almeida bored me to tears. I think it did most of you. Mario Bautista versus Umar was pretty exciting. And it really showed that rankings don't mean shit sometimes. I mean, Bautista was ranked, I believe, number 9, taking on the number 2 ranked guy, and he nearly knocked him out with a knee. Bautista showed his skill, and it was a great fight. The co-main event, I mean, it was kind of the fight I expected. Not too crazy entertaining, but not overly boring. But I think the biggest problem on this card, and I think most people know it, the unfortunate no contest between Aspinall and Gane when Gane poked Aspinall's eyes badly. And, I will die on this hill. Aspinall is not a quitter. He got poked knuckle deep in the eye, and you cannot convince me otherwise. Gone. And, I don't think Aspinall's a quitter. I think most people calling him that are kind of full of shit. But, again, that's all my personal opinion. Again, most of this is also my personal, somewhat biased opinion. I can't lie and say this is an objective list. This is all my personal feelings on these cards. But I like to think what I'm saying has at least some merit, and I at least enjoy talk about my opinion with you guys. But let's keep going on with this. So overall, I just thought the no contest really hurt the card and just continues to put a fucking curse on this heavyweight division. So when you think of like the impact on it, it left a lot to be desired. Like that main card kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. And again, it's one of those instances where, besides paying $80 for a pay-per-view, just like in general, imagine you spend your hard-earned money on this, and this is the results you get: a terribly boring fight, a co-main event that nobody was really excited for to begin with, and then a no contest. It does leave a bad taste in your mouth. So that's the big reason for me why this is number 12. Moving on, number 11, UFC 313 Pereira versus Ankalaev. The biggest reason I think this is number 11 to me was a lot of the pullouts on this card. You had some significant matchups, or at the very least, some really fun matchups, literally get pulled out at the absolute minute. About a day before the fight, like Chris Gutierrez versus John Castaneda got pulled out. Curtis Blades versus Ruzian Kuniev got pulled out as well due to an undisclosed illness. And so that kind of hurt the card. Now the anticipation I thought was relatively high at the time. Like when you look at the card at first, you had like Joshua Van versus Bruno Ferreira. Unfortunately, Ferreira pulled out and was placed by Ray Saruya. But you look at the main card, right? Marcinho Hufi versus Bobby Green looked like a fun striking fight on paper. Amanda Lamos versus Yasmin Lucindo, a possible change in the guard, and usually Lamos is usually in fun fights, or at least from my recollection up until this point. Ignacio Bahamondes versus Jalen Turner, the battle of lightweight skyscrapers, and then the co-main event, which was originally supposed to be Dan Hooker versus Justin Gaethje, which was a possible fight of the year, and quite literally a just bleed matchup. Unfortunately, that fight, Hooker got pulled out, and again, a big hit on the card. But we did get a great replacement in the rematch between Gaethje and Fiziev, and then obviously Pereira versus Ankalaev, a fight many people were anticipating, as it was the more or less dominant champion. I think you can call Pereira that at the time, 3 title defenses, and seemingly looking more and more unstoppable, more or less, against the rightful number 1 contender, and the guy most people were convinced was going to beat Pereira and dethrone him. So I thought overall the anticipation was high, but then when you got to fight day and you heard like 2 of the fights got pulled out literally last minute as possible, it's just one of those situations where your expectation and excitement kind of go down, like, I was really looking forward to that. Now, in practice, there were some fights that I thought could have delivered more. Some fights that I thought delivered just exactly what I was thinking. And overall, some fights that I thought were boring AF. So, like, just looking at some of the prelim fights, and again, it's just like how small and short this card was. I mean, the whole card felt like that. And as there was only, give me 1 minute, just about 10 fights on the card. It leaves a lot to be desired, as like you're looking for an enjoyable long time of fights, and then it all ends like that. Now, there were some highlights of the card. Joshua Van versus Ray Saruya, a battle of prospects more or less in the flyweight division, and the continued rise of Joshua Van. Carlos Leal beating the absolute crap out of Alex Morona was absolutely fun and sensational to watch. The robbery of Myron Santos versus Francis Marshall did kind of dull the card a bit, and sometimes you see robberies like that, it does leave a bad taste in your mouth, I find. Bruno Ferreira beating Armin Petrosian the way he did was absolutely spectacular. And then you look at the main card, there were some, the biggest thing find about the main card, there were some ups and there were some downs. The wheel kick KO of Hoofy against Bobby Green was spectacular. Another fight of the year contender. In the fight of the night with Justin Gaethje and Rafael Fiziev, that was an absolute treat. It was awesome to see Gaethje bounce back from the horrible, vicious knockout loss he had suffered beforehand. But then you look at some of the other fights on the main card. Lamos versus Yasmin Lucindo. That was a terrible, terrible fight. It was so boring to watch. I think it was just as boring as Almeida versus Volkov. Or maybe even boringer, because at least Volkov was throwing strikes from bottom. And then you look at the main event. Now, let me be clear. This card is not the third worst or, number 11 because I was mad Ankalaev beat Pereira. That is not the reason this is on the list. Or its placement on the list. But the fight overall was pretty disappointing to the hype and anticipation that seemed to be built up. As it was, majority of it was Ankalaev holding Pereira against the fence and kind of just smothering him over it. Now, there were some moments of the fight that I did enjoy. Ankalaev rocking Pereira was pretty entertaining to a degree, not so much as a Pereira fan, but like just a moment where you're going, oh my God, that was exciting. Pereira actually taking down Ankalaev with that, I think it was, the outside trip. That was impressive. And also some of just seeing Pereira just deny all of Ankalaev's takedowns. As a Pereira fan, that was a treat to watch. But overall, as myself, as a Pereira fan, and overall hoping that if Pereira's going to lose, it's at least going to be a spectacular or fun fight. Seeing him get held against the cage for, majority of the fight definitely left a lot to be desired. Especially for Ankalaev, who was going on and on about, no more Shama, no more Shama, I'm taking you back to the tire shop. And then that's the type of performance we get and the type of fight we get. Yeah, I'm going to need a bit more to put it higher up on the list. So that's the biggest reason for me. Number 10. UFC 318 Holloway versus Poirier 3. Now, overall, this card was pretty anticipated, or at least for me, because this was the last dance for Dustin Poirier. Really, these pay-per-views should get like a little title, like literally UFC 318, Holloway versus Poirier 3, the last dance. Would have been perfect title. But either way, this was somewhat anticipated, again, from my personal view and some of the other like UFC fans and pundits, because this was the last fight for Poirier. This was the last time you were going to see the diamond in the octagon. Now, of course, this could change because MMA retirements never last. But it really did feel like a culmination of all of Poirier's hard work, his highs and lows throughout his career, and just seeing the career of a man who, went to the summit, the height of popularity, the height of wealth for his family, for his community, for his charities, all of that. Being able to see this man goes from a prelim fighter and someone who, some fans didn't fully respect to one of the most beloved fighters ever. And then seeing the just the hype and all of this card just built around him against an opponent he beat in Holloway. But, for the BMF title, and, say what you want about that belt. It's a gimmick. I understand this. But the legacy of the BMF belt has slowly but surely been absolutely amazing. From the Diaz Masvidal fight to the rematch between Gaethje Poirier, Gaethje Holloway, and then the trilogy. The BMF belt has slowly garnered a legacy that I not only respect, but I greatly enjoy because it gives me fun fights like these. But to my point, just having Poirier have a whole card wrapped around him, the anticipation and hype was real for me. And seeing what could possibly be his last fight and seeing his last dance, it was absolutely exciting just to think about it. Now, that being said, the card as a whole, there were some fights where I was not too excited about. Because you look at some of the fights on the card, like the main card, it had some fun fights for sure. Paulo Costa versus Roman Kopylov looked exciting on paper. Kevin Holland versus Daniel Rodriguez, fun scrap. Patricio Pitbull versus Dan Ige. Again, another fun fight to look forward to. And Michael Johnson versus Daniel Zellhuber. Like, some of these were actually fun fights. And the prelims had some pretty good fights. I mean, shoot, this had more ranked fights than fucking UFC 312. That should tell you something. Like Vinicius Oliveira versus Kyler Phillips, or Brendan Allen versus Marvin Vettori. Like, it had some fun fights and some absolutely stellar prospects to look out for on this card, like Abatie Gutier or Islam Dolatov. So there were some so like I said, there were some fights to really look out for this card. But again, for pay-per-view, some of the fights I thought I don't think there was a single fighter who was ranked in the top 10 except for one. That was the Brandon Allen versus Marvin Vettori fight. That was it. Now, not including the main event with Holloway versus Poirier, no other fight besides one on the prelims were against top 10 ranked contenders, which, you know, I understand not every card needs that, not necessarily. Sometimes not even pay-per-views necessarily need that, but it always feels more impactful if you see, more highly ranked fights on this card, which unfortunately didn't have. But so that's kind of dulled the anticipation. Now, in practice, I thought the start of this card was absolutely phenomenal. Carly Judiz, Bruno Ferreira, Ryan Spann, Jimmy Crute, Ismail Dolatov, and Abatie Gutier started this card off right. Absolutely exciting submissions and knockouts. Like, Carly Judiz became a absolute prospect for me to watch in this women's flyweight division. Bruno Ferreira continuing on in his submission streak against Jason McVeigh, and then seeing like Ismail Dolatov, like not only knocking out Adam Fugit, but then going right afterwards in his post-fight interview, seeing if, hey guys, am I good to do my photo shoot? I mean, that's just like awesome. And then Abatie Gutier steamrolling Robert Valentine. Again, was a treat to watch. I thought the card kind of dulled a little bit, as afterwards, every single fight started ending in decision. Now, I said before, not every fight needs to have a finish, but when you start off your card that strong and then you start going to decision after decision, I feel like some of that momentum that it built up slowly died down. Now that said, there were some absolutely fun fights. Brendan Allen versus Marvin Vettori was an excellent fight. Both guys really went after each other and pushed a good pace for 15 minutes. And then you look at the main card. The biggest thing about this main card that was pretty exciting for fans is a lot of unks won this card. And almost every single underdog won as well. Michael Johnson beat Daniel Zellhuber, who, he's pushing like 39 or 40. And seeing him beat Zellhuber, who is more or less I wouldn't say Dana White privilege, but it's definitely someone the UFC has been promoting, for the Mexican crowd. Patricio Pitbull getting a big win against Dan Ige. Not the most entertaining fight, but certainly it was nice to see a Bellator fighter, especially the greatest Bellator fighter like Pitbull, get a win in the UFC. Daniel Rodriguez versus Kevin Holland was an amazing fight. It was kind of shocking seeing Kevin Holland lose a fight that he seemingly on paper he should have won. But just the D-Rod just showing that heart and grit. Hell, Holland showing his grit, getting dropped multiple times in that fight and still fighting on. The vintage Paulo Costa returning against Roman Kopylov. That was amazing. And then finally, the main event. Overall, that was the big selling point of the fight. It's like, depending on how that fight performed, I think really affected the impact this card had on you. And so I thought it was a great fight. Absolutely. Not the best fight on the card, which was unfortunate. But I thought this was exactly Poirier's retirement fight, because he didn't take as many risks as before, and it showed like, yeah, it's time to hang it up. He, in the past, you saw he had a sort of reckless abandonment at times, but this time, he fought with a bit more safety to him, I thought, and I saw it, and I definitely think that is what led to him to retire. And then, I mean, the farewell package and just the whole card in general, like, celebrating Poirier. You got to see like I said, that retirement package they did for him, and then seeing Poirier, lay down the gloves, hugging his coaches, his family, his teammates at ATT, and then Holloway just being a man's man, going to the Louisiana crowd and going, cheer louder for your man Dustin Poirier. I mean, honestly, it brings a tear to your eyes, I think, or it definitely brought a tear to my eye. It was just an absolutely beautiful thing to watch. So overall, I thought the impact was significant. The biggest reason I have this lower is I thought some of the other fights, or sorry, other pay-per-views had, I think, either A, more exciting fights, two main events that I thought delivered more hype and anticipation, as well as delivered. But make no mistake, this was a great card. And in fact, I think most of these pay-per-views that I'm ranking were great cards, except for the first three that I talked about. But overall, I have this at number 10. Now, going on to number 9. UFC 316, Dvalishvili versus O'Malley 2. I thought overall the reason I had this a little higher than 318 was I think there were some fights on this card that I genuinely were looking forward to a bit more. Now, the hype and anticipation on this card wasn't as great because I thought O'Malley did not deserve his title shot, his immediate rematch against Dvalishvili, having not fought anybody in over a year, or sorry, almost exactly a year since losing his belt to Marab. Or yeah, almost a year, like a little over 9 months. So that kind of dulled the anticipation. But there were some other fights that looked very exciting, like seeing Kayla Harrison potentially fulfill what was kind of perceived as her destiny by beating Juliana Pena for the women's bantamweight belt. And plus, that press conference at UFC 314 hyping up that Amanda Nunes was going to return and fight the winner, that kind of added a little more anticipation for me, with Harrison possibly winning, and in fact she did win, to set up one of the greatest women's fights that we are possibly getting, next month. And then like Joe Pyfer, Kelvin Gastelum, that was an interesting test to see how Joe Pyfer would continue his rise. Mario Bautista versus Patchy Mix. It was supposed to be Chito Vera, which unfortunately with Vera pulling out did dampen the card, but at the time, the debut of Patchy Mix was definitely something to behold, as Patchy Mix was one of the best Bellator fighters, or one of the best bantamweights outside the UFC. So seeing his debut in the UFC was definitely an intrigue. And then Kevin Holland versus Vicente Luque seemed like a really fun fight on paper. Two guys who always go for the finish, and both guys who could not only knock their opponents out silly, but submit them as well. And then some of the fights on the prelims were honestly very anticipated, like Andreas Gustafsson's debut, Joshua Van versus Bruno Silva, Azamat Murzakanov on this card. The continuous, and then another prospect, Quinlan Salkeld, and then the prospect of Ju Sang Yu as well. There were some fights to look forward to on this card for sure. Now, how this card performed, it's hard to say if the prelims were better than UFC 318. There were some great fights on this card, make no mistake about it. Seeing Quinlan Salkeld show that he's actually a well-rounded fighter in not only wrestling and grappling, but his striking, not just his striking, but his wrestling and grappling against Yanel Ashmus was great. The 28-second knockout of Jeke Saraki when Ju Sang Yu fired off that left hook so fast, if you blinked, you missed it. That was spectacular. Azamat Murzakanov continuing his dominance, and that undefeated record running through Brenton Ribeiro. Andreas Gustafsson mauling Chaos Williams like he owed him money was absolutely kind of shocking, to be honest. And then Joshua Van putting on an absolute masterclass against Bruno Silva. Then the prelims, there were some very fun fights on this card. And I thought how these prelims ended in comparison to how the prelims for 318 ended, I think carried more momentum for me as we head to the main card. Now, looking at the main card for 316, I thought this card delivered on some very fun excitement. Of all the finishes on this card, all of them ended in submissions. Kevin Holland submitting Vicente Luque with his own submission, the Anaconda, was a treat. And seeing one of the more complete performances from Kevin Holland in recent memory, that was absolutely spectacular. Mario Bautista, beating up the stiff board that was Patchy Mix, was, while I think surprising to some, certainly was to me. Kind of Bautista is showing he's not as boring as a fighter I think most people had anticipated. Because, I mean, one boring fight against Jose Aldo, and all of a sudden he is a wet blanket. I don't get that. For me, I understand, boring fight against a legend, you're going to be hated by the fans. But overall, I thought Mario Bautista put on a fun fight against Patchy Mix, who was stiff as a board. Pyfer versus Gastelum. The first round was awesome. Him dropping Gastelum twice was absolutely shocking. But then the fight kind of dulled. But then the two title fights, Harrison making easy work of Juliana Pena, and then setting up the Nunes fight, for me, really left a big impact, as then you had the anticipation of, man, Nunes versus Harrison. Truly, whoever wins is the greatest, possibly the greatest female fighter. I mean, I know Nunes is the GOAT, but you get my point. Just a stellar fight for the division. And then Merab Dvalishvili, not only dominating O'Malley again, but submitting him with the north-south choke, was something not only unexpected, but added much more, I thought, to this card for me than I thought 318 did. Because not only did you have Merab beating O'Malley in a fight most people thought Merab was going to win. I don't think most people gave O'Malley a shot. But then seeing Merab submit him via a submission you very, very rarely see in MMA nowadays, the north-south choke, honestly just, I think, elevated Merab to a degree and showed most people that Merab was starting to be a much more exciting fighter since his title win against O'Malley. And then before this, he had the incredible fight against Umar. So I think that's the biggest thing for me. Overall, I think the impact was two champions fulfilling, or sorry, Kayla Harrison fulfilling more or less her destiny in becoming the women's bantamweight champion when Nunes left. Dvalishvili continuing his reign of dominance and showing he's becoming much, much more of a threat. And not only did he get to the summit, he continues to rise. That was impressive. And overall, I thought some of the finishes and even decision wins on this card were pretty entertaining. Hey, so that's why I have this a little higher up on the list. Number 8, UFC 315, Muhammad versus Della Maddalena. I think this is one of the cards that, for me, is higher up on the list because it not only met expectations, it surpassed its expectations. I remember thinking during the, not only the fight week, but just like the weeks leading up to this card with Muhammad versus Maddalena, a lot of people weren't that excited for it. Not because this, well, one, because of how Belal Muhammad's reputation of a boring fighter kind of dulled people's excitement for this card. But overall, most people weren't super excited for this Canadian pay-per-view because, as you know, you look at a few Canadian pay-per-views, they were not the most exciting. And now you look at this card on paper, right? Shevchenko making her first title defense of her second reign against Manon Fiorot, who was, you know, the rightful number one contender, but I think a fight most people, especially I thought anyway, it's probably going to be a boring fight. The more or less baffling matchmaking of Ayman Zahabi versus Jose Aldo, when, you know, most people wanted to see Aldo get a good veteran treatment or a legend treatment, you know, fight a fellow legend like Dominic Cruz. Natalia Silva versus Alexa Grasso seemed like a possibly exciting fight and definitely a fight to determine the number one contender. So that was an important fight on this card. And then what was originally supposed to be Yoel Alvarez versus Benoit Saint-Denis in what was going to be an awesome fight. Unfortunately, Alvarez pulled out, and it was instead Kyle Prepelec, which, you know, kind of unfortunately made the card take a big hit. And then you look at some of the prelims, right? Mostly just showing Canadian talent, like Mike Malott, like Jasmine Jasudavicius, or Marc-Andre Barrios, that kind of stuff. But again, I think the biggest thing for the the hype was simply the main event. Like JDM coming back after beating Burns last March, getting a title shot against stylistic his worst matchup, led a lot of fans, I think, to think he was just going to get wrestle fucked for 25 minutes. But then you saw the card, and I think it just exceeded expectations greatly. That main event was one of the best title fights this year. In general, one of the best fights this year for sure, as JDM and Belal Muhammad fought tooth and nail for the belt. And seeing JDM rise to the occasion to put on a absolutely championship-making performance against Belal Muhammad, a fighter most people did not give him a chance, was absolutely spectacular. Ayman Zahabi versus Jose Aldo was a spectacular fight. So fun, and we got to see at least a little bit of vintage Jose Aldo before he retired in the cage, which, you know, his UFC career came full circle. If you know, Aldo made his UFC debut in his first title fight against Mark Hominick in Canada, and so he ends his career in Canada. So it was definitely a nice full circle moment seeing a legend like Aldo retire in Canada. And then some of the prelims were absolutely ecstatic. Mike Malott's knockout of Charles Radke, Jasmine Jasudavicius running right through Jessica Andrade like it was no problem. The more kind of terrifying knockout of Marc-Andre Barrio against Bruno Silva, and then Bekzat Almakhan just destroying Brad Katona. Overall, the biggest reason this card is a little higher up on the list is because it's one of the definitions of a card that exceeded expectation greatly. And one that I think I'm going to remember a lot longer than some of the other ones, simply due to the fact of how my expectations were greatly exceeded with this card. Moving on. Number 7. Now, note, 7 and 1, all these cards were exciting in one way, shape, or form. There were maybe 1 or 2 gripes I have with them, but overall, I was greatly entertained for a majority of the time. These are more or less the cards where my personal opinion, my personal opinions really come into play. But without further ado, let's continue. Number 7, UFC 319, Duplessis versus Chimaev. The anticipation for this card was so great. I mean, you were looking at one of the most anticipated middleweight fights in history against a champion, or against the immovable champion that was Dricus du Plessis versus the unstoppable contender that was Khamzat Chimaev, a champion who was, forged in the fire and was looking for. Sorry, something caught my throat. Like I said, you had a champion kind of born in the fire with du Plessis, who continued to just defy expectations over and over and over again against a fighter in Khamzat who most people, especially in his debut, thought, okay, he's fighting for the belt. It's just a matter of when. And then, some things kept fucking up along the way. Either him missing weight, being sick, fighting once a year. But finally, we had reached the moment. Khamzat Chimaev was finally fighting for the belt. And we would see if all the hype, all the excitement, all the more or less prediction of him getting to this point was going to come true. And then you look at the main card, it was so spectacular. Lerone Murphy versus Aaron Pico. It was a great clash of styles. Carlos Prates versus Jeff Neal. Destruction on a epic scale. MVP versus Jared Cannonier. Another great clash of styles. And then Tim Elliott versus Kaya Sakura was, I think Luke Thomas said it best, two cats in a bag type fight. Just two guys who were going to scrap. And then some of the other fights on this card had some great anticipation. Barbosa returning to lightweight. The debut of Baizongar Sursakayev, who was, training buddies with Khamzat. Alexander Hernandez versus Chase Hooper and stuff like that. So overall, the anticipation was pretty high for this card. Then how it executed. Some of the prelims left a lot to be desired, like Karine Silva, Diana Barbosa, Lupino Godinez versus Jessica Andrade, was a pretty fun fight. Hernandez knocking out Chase Hooper was a bit sad for me because I like Chase Hooper, but it was what it was. Seeing poor GM3 destroyed by Mikhail Alexiouchuk was hard to watch. And then seeing Sursakayev versus Tom Nolan in the feature prelim definitely made me think I'm not going to buy into the hype of Sursakayev, and I do believe one day he's going to lose. But Rose Eric Nolan's stock, as this guy is a welterweight moving up and fighting against Sursakayev and putting it on him until those leg kicks just fucked him up and got submitted. Now that main card, from the main card opener to the co-main event, was absolutely spectacular. Tim Elliott getting a good win against Kaya Sakura, submitting him. And overall, just showing, and then just seeing an OG like Tim Elliott get a win like that was such a fun thing to watch. Michael Venom Page styling on Jared Cannonier for the first 2 rounds. I like watching MVP fight most of the time, and I don't think I was really bored by it. It was a little boring watching Cannonier kind of hold him from top position, not really going after the finish. That was a bit disappointing. But then 2 back-to-back spinning back elbows, Prates against Neal and then Murphy against Pico. I mean, that was spectacular. I mean, you literally have 2 knockout of the year contenders back-to-back. And I think one was a bit spectacular than the other, but overall was absolutely exciting. The biggest thing I had about this card was the main event. My anticipation for this main event was great. I thought this was going to be an amazing fight, maybe a back and forth, maybe not. But then seeing how the main event ended the way it did, I was greatly bored and greatly disappointed because Hamzat kind of just held du Plessis. Now, again, it's not all Hamzat's fault. He did what he had to win. And, part of the blame does go to du Plessis for not being prepared enough and not getting up. But good God, you'd think Hamzat would at least open up more with his ground and pound or something. But nope, just mostly got to the crucifix, more or less to half guard, and then kind of just peppering with shots. Like the stats you watch on this fight is greatly exaggerated because a lot of those shots are not damaging whatsoever. They are literally just peppering. And so I think the biggest reason this card isn't higher on the list for me is I just think a great disappointment for me in the main event. But overall, the impact was great. I'm going to remember those spinning back elbow knockouts back to back for years. I mean, literally the audible just clunk you hear from Protez's elbow to Neil. Spectacular. I'm never going to forget it. But overall, I think just the overall disappointment of the main event is what lowers this card for me. Moving on, number 6, UFC 322, Makhachev versus Della Maddalena. Della Maddalena versus Makhachev. This was one of the most anticipated cards of the year. In fact, maybe the most anticipated card of the year, really. It's either this one or my number 2 pick for me. Number 2 and number 3. Because you look at that main card, Islam versus Jack Della Maddalena for the welterweight belt. 2-division glory for Islam and possibly tying Anderson Silva's win streak. Valentina Shevchenko versus Zhang Weili, a fight to determine who is the best best women's fighter in the world today. And then that welterweight tournament we had basically with Michael Morales versus Sean Brady, Carlos Prates versus Leon Edwards. Just like amazing. You saw the welterweight belt up for grabs, and you saw what could have possibly been 2 number 1 contender fights. Then Beneil Dariush versus Benoit Saint-Denis, Bo Nickel versus Rodolfo Vieira. Almost every single fight on this card just screamed fun action. Now in practice, I think most of them more or less this card delivered. Not all the fights on the prelims were super exciting. Like, I thought Roman Kopylov versus Gregory Rodriguez was going to be a bit more fun, but, it's the fight we got. Pat Sabatini versus Chepe Mariscal was an okay fight. Fun scrambles, but nothing to write home about, I thought. Mateus Nicolau versus Vyacheslav Borshev was kind of boring, I'm going to be honest. But then some of the finishes on this card were awesome. Literally, Ethan Ewing coming in on 2 days' notice, whooping Malcolm Wellmaker was amazing. Spectacular watch. Kyle Dawkins destroying Mearshard in 50 seconds. Fatima Klein continuing to increase her status as a prospect against Angela Hill. And then Bo Nickel with the vicious head kick against Rodolfo Vieira was a highlight of the prelims for sure. And then that main card, the momentum we carried from Nickel's head kick to the first 3 fights on the main card, we just had spectacular knockout after knockout after knockout. Benoit running through Dariush, Prates sleeping Leon Edwards bad. And then Michael Morales showing how dangerous of a phenom this guy is at only 25 when he beat Sean Brady. Such great momentum. And then the co-main event happened. I mean, look, I knew there was a possibility of Shevchenko being the bigger fighter, holding Weili down, but I did not think it was going to be that fucking boring. It was so damn unfortunate because the card had such great momentum. Like first to second round knockouts, and then that co-main event really, really halted the momentum to nearly a skid. And then the main event, which was super anticipated for me too, or at least for me, then seeing the way it ended. Again, I don't fully blame Islam. I don't fully blame Shevchenko. They did what they had to win, but man, was there just so much that these fights could have been. These fights could have been so much more, and unfortunately, the way I see it is the main event is the last fight you're probably going to remember. And so generally speaking, you want to end on a high note. So seeing the main, especially the co-main as well, end in the way they did does leave a bit of a bad taste in your mouth. But the impact is very significant. Seeing Islam become the 11th double champion, Shevchenko stamping her claim as the best female fighter today, and then Islam tying Anderson Silva's win streak does leave a big impact. And plus, those spectacular knockouts this card had. I mean, come on. They were awesome. So that's why it's still pretty high up on the list. And now we get to the top 5. One moment, please. Moving up. Number 5. UFC 311 Makhachev versus Moicano. The first card to start the year, the first pay-per-view to start the year. And overall, on paper, this was an exciting card. The original fight between Islam Makhachev and Arman Sarukian, that was exactly the perfect type of fight to start the year off. The number 1 contender versus the pound for pound best fighter in the world. It was absolutely the perfect one. Now, Sarukian, a day before the fight, pulling out, left a lot to be desired. Like, damn, not only did we lose the great main event, but we also lost Hinata Moicano versus Dariush. As Moicano, credit to him and, the huevos on him to fight Islam on a day's notice. Credit to him. But unfortunately, it felt like one of those just simply too good to be true. But the whole rest of the card, though, man, there were so many fun fights. Marab versus Umar. For literally, what looked like one of the best bantamweight fights on paper, and especially in the division's history. Yuri Prohaska versus Jamal Hill had knockout written all over it. Jailton Almeida versus Sergey Spivak was could be fun. And then Renier de Ritter versus Kevin Holland, that definitely seemed exciting. Plus, the prospect at the time, Payne Talbot, Grant Dawson versus Diego Ferreira, definitely awesome. And some of the other fights, like some other undefeated prospects to look out for, like Lane Carpenter, Rene Nakamura, and Nurmagomedov and Talbot. Now in practice, I thought the start of the card, unfortunately, wasn't as exciting. Like, Tagir Ulanbekov versus Clayton Carpenter was pretty good. Bernardo Sopai versus Ricky Turcios was an all-right card. Moon Gafarov versus Rene Nakamura. It was hard to enjoy because of how low Nakamura's fight IQ was in that fight. Then Eileen Perez versus Carla Rosa. She twerked at the end. That's just what Eileen Perez is going to do. But then I thought, when we got to Grant Dawson versus Diego Ferreira, I thought the card started to pick up. The guillotine win for Bogdan Gustaf was fun. Azamat Bakoyev smashing Zach Reese and the ref joining too was pretty fun. Honey Barcelos giving a veteran lesson to Payne Talbot was pretty sad because I enjoyed Talbot as a prospect. But granted, Talbot needed that loss more or less as he just became so much better. But boy, that main card was excellent. One of the best main cards you're going to find on a pay-per-view this year. The submission of Kevin Holland from Renier de Ritter. The TKO from Jailton Almeida, showing why was it so boring against Volkov. But then one of the ecstatic fight between Yuri Prohaska and Jamal Hill, where those two were looking to take the other's head off. And then what might be the best bantamweight title fight we had ever seen in Marab versus Umar. And then Islam showing his dominance. So overall, the impact and how the fights play out, I think the biggest thing that hurts this card was the beginning of the prelims were much to be desired. But as we started to continue to move up the card, I thought the excitement just continued to rise. But I think these next 4, I think, started great and ended great. That's why UFC 311 is number 5. Now, number 4, UFC 323. Davalishvili versus Yan 2. So I thought the anticipation for this card wasn't the highest in comparison to the last 3. But I definitely know for a fact that there was definitely some excitement, as not only was this the last card of the year, but it looked like a card that could end off with a bang. You had so many fights that were of 155 pounds or lower. You had 2 fights that were, 3 fights that were 170 or higher. Well, really, it was 185 to 205 pounds, but still. And, Marab trying to cement his legacy was an excitement onto itself. Trying to make 4 title defenses in a calendar year was a feat nobody had achieved. Pantoja versus Joshua Van, possibly seeing the youngest contender ever, was exciting. The retirement of Henry Cejudo. I thought the anticipation for this card was high. And then, boy, that card was amazing. Absolutely spectacular. Of the whole prelims, only 2 decisions. spectacular bar fight between Iwo oh, sorry. Zankari, I'm sorry, against Ibo Aslan. One of the greatest, Iwo versus Ibo, the greatest bar fight I've ever seen in MMA. Bruno Ferreira versus Marvin Vettori was an alright fight, but then like Farazi Ham showing he's a step ahead against Nazim Salikov was spectacular. Chris Duncan surviving the storm and submitting Terrence McKinney, and then Manuel Torres smashing through Grant Dawson. And then that main card, it kind of got off to a rocky start. I thought we had some great momentum. Then the draw to in Jan Blachowicz versus Bogdan Gustaf kind of dulled it a bit for me. But then those next 4 fights, well, I take it back. The disappointment of Pantoja breaking his arm. Sorry, I can't remember if he dislocated it or broke it. But, you know, the arm injury he suffered against Joshua Van left a really sour note on what was a spectacular main card for me. Peyton Talbot against Henry Cejudo was an amazing fight. It was my favorite fight up until the main event. Tatsuro Taira getting the finish over Brandon Moreno was a shocker. I thought an early stoppage, but it was exciting to see a new threat truly rise in this division in Tatsuro Taira, who not only am I high on, just like I thought him versus Joshua Van is going to be an excellent fight. And then the main event against Petr Yan versus Merab, the rematch. I think quite possibly is my favorite title fight of the year. Just simply the storyline of seeing Yan, who, let's face it, I was picking Merab, you were picking Merab. 90% of people were picking Merab to beat Petr Yan the rematch. And then seeing Yan defy the odds, beat the machine, made the machine look human, was quite a feat. And then seeing one of the most exciting fighters in the division, I think quite possibly the whole UFC, get the belt back was a treat to watch. The biggest reason this is number 4, not my top 3. The Pantoja fight kind of dulled it, or not dulled it, but left a sour taste because that fight I thought was shaping up to be exciting. The draw between Blachowicz and Gustaf, not a bad fight by any stretch, but just like we had such great momentum going on, and then there were some moments in that fight that were just kind of dull. But overall, great prelims, great main card. Again, this is all at the end of the day, my personal opinion. But make no mistake, this was a fantastic card to end the year. Spec-fucking-tacular. Moving up to our top 3. At number 3, we have UFC 317 Topuria versus Oliveira. So, obviously, the anticipation for this card was pretty high. Seeing the possibility of Topuria getting a second belt in his UFC career, which wasn't that long of a UFC career, but considering the momentum he had built up to that point, the kind of the myth he was trying to build up as El Matador was pretty exciting. Plus, the co-main event, possibly seeing the continual dominance of Alexandre Pantoja against Kai Kara France was exciting. Joshua Van stepping in on like 3 weeks' notice to take on Brandon Royval in a number 1 contenders fight definitely brought the excitement level up. Then seeing 2 elite prospects in bantamweight against Payne Talbot and Felipe Lima was exciting. And then seeing the rebooking of Beneil Dariush and Renato Moicano. Then you look at some of the prelims, they were exciting. Possibly exciting fights. Gregory Rodriguez versus Jack Hermanson. Jose Delgado versus Hyder Mill, 2 prospects at featherweight. And then and also hype prospect in Jacoby Smith against Nico Price. Overall, the fights on this card the prelims, like UFC 323, were just as exciting. Only 2 decisions in the whole prelims. And then after that, exciting knockout after knockout and submissions as well. I mean, Rodriguez killing Hermanson and Delgado destroying what was seemingly a great chin of a Mill were absolutely spectacular to watch. Then the main card, it's hard to describe, but Talbot versus Felipe Lima was very fun. Moicano versus Dariush kind of was a boring fight to me. I mean, there were some great moments like Moicano dropping Dariush, and just seeing Dariush get a win back after the knockouts he had suffered was pretty nice to see. But then the fight of the year between Joshua Van and Brandon Royval, that might be my fight of the year. Again, I'm going to have to really look over some of the other contenders for that, but that might be fight of the year for me. Was amazing, really hyped up this card. And then seeing the dominance of Pantoja and Topuria when Pantoja submitted Kai Kara France in a fight where he just showed his absolute dominance. And then Topuria knocking out Oliveira in the second round, in the first round, like he said he would, was just spectacular. Those last two fights, the co-main and main event, were the exact right ways I would feel a main event should end. And overall, I thought this was a great card. The impact was so significant. Just seeing Topuria continuing to build his legacy on quality rather than quantity, and Pantoja the opposite, not just quality but quantity, and seeing how he had built up this win streak to this point, and trying to cement himself as the greatest flyweight of all time. Now he unfortunately wasn't able to do so, but the second greatest, undeniable. Now moving up. Number 2. And let me tell you guys, I struggled picking number 1 and number 2 greatly. I kept jogging back and forth in my mind. But I think this was the right. But trust me when I say this, I truly struggled. And these two fights are great. You could pick either one as number 1, and I would not debate you whatsoever. You would be right in some way, shape, and you would be right. But for me, number 2, UFC 320. Ankalaev versus Pereira 2. My own personal hype and anticipation was great for this card. Poatan trying to capture the belt. Ankalaev, who had been not undefeated, but on a long unbeaten streak, and had the second longest win streak in the division's history, against Pereira, who was looking to get his belt back, was something that I was just looking forward to fucking greatly. Then you look at the rest of that card. Merab versus Sandhagen. Merab making 3 title defenses against Sandhagen, who was a rightful number 1 contender, and just seeing the activity of Merab was just fun. Just seeing an active champion was just so great. Yuri versus Roundtree. I mean, it had fight of the year written all over it, possibly finish of the year as well, and I think it delivered. Pfeiffer versus Abus was a great fight on paper. Yusuf Zalal versus Josh Emmett, and some of the prelims looked on paper fun. Again, some great prospects. Ju Sang Yu, Abate Gutier, and then a few other fights I thought were picking up. Now, the big reason this is number 2, I think at the start, the prelims kind of had to garner some momentum for me. Like Victoria Hardy against Borgen Walker was like, nah. Farid Basharat versus Cruz Gutierrez, it was all right. Nothing too spectacular. Same with Polioni Soriano and Nikolai Vernatanikov, nor Yana Santos versus Meshi Chanson. Honestly, the best fight on the early prelims for me was Ramiz Brahimaj versus Austin Vanderford. Then the prelims, however, that's where things got really exciting. Emin Shabazian knocking out Andre Muniz. Okay, Jacob Whitlack versus Patchy Mix. Boring for me. But Daniel Santos knocking out my boy, the Zombie Jr. was hard to watch, but fun at the same time, I guess, because it was a good, fun fight. Bate Gutier destroying Tristan Vines like he was absolutely supposed to. I thought it was a good way to end the prelims. That main card, again, fucking spectacular. Pfeiffer's submission over Abus was awesome to watch. Zalal running through Josh Emmett like that. I mean, who does that to Josh Emmett? Nobody arm bars Josh Emmett like that, like it was fucking easy. Was it spectacular? Yuri Prohaska versus Khalil Roundtree. Absolute cinema. One of the greatest fights. Again, that might be my fight of the year too. It's hard to say. But certainly comeback of the year, and certainly one of the knockouts of the year for sure. Merab hurting Corey Sandhagen in a way I've never seen before. And like I said, showing you not only got to the summit, but you're continuing to rise. And then the Poatan magic done it again when he knocked out Magomed Ankalaev in the first round in a minute and change, and made Pereira look like, Pereira made it look like he was fighting a bum. Could not have been better. As a Pereira fan, seeing that, I remember distinctly just hopping out of my seat, yelling Shama at the top of my lungs. The impact and the fights on this card, not only that, just the anticipation, all of it was truly 10 out of 10. It delivered in every way, shape, or form for me, this main card, and that's why it's number 2. But for number 1, and my favorite pay-per-view of the year, UFC 314, Volkanovski versus Lopez. Now, I won't lie. The biggest reason for me this is number 1 for me is because I have a personal connection to this card as this was the first pay-per-view I went to live. I went from North Carolina to Miami, went with my dad to watch this card live. Really, literally went to the first fight of the night and stayed till the main event. But even then, you look at the anticipation. This was one of the most anticipated cards we could have gotten. I mean, Volkanovski looking to redeem himself and get his belt back against Diego, the vacant belt against Diego Lopez, who was a berserker and someone who I thought earned his title shot fair and square. Was absolutely exciting. Paddy Pimblett versus Michael Chandler had fight of the night written all over it, and a win-win for either way. You'd think about it, because Paddy Pimblett showing he belongs in the top 10, or Michael Chandler staying in the top 10 and continuing to have high-profile fights. The much anticipated debut of Patricio Pitbull versus Yair Rodriguez was something very interesting to see how Pitbull would transition to UFC. And then Jean Silva versus Bryce Mitchell. The build up to that fight was spectacular. And overall, just so many memorable moments I had with this card, from the whole arena shouting at the top of our lungs when Dominic Reyes beat Nikita Krylov, to meeting two great friends of mine who I'm friends with now today. So, shout out to you, Mason. Shout out to you, Justin. And then, I remember distinctly when John Silva and Bryce Mitchell fought. My side of the arena were barking like dogs, going rough, rough, just like cheering for Silva in that way. To the other half of the arena going, fuck Bryce Mitchell. Just so many memorable moments. And then seeing Paddy Pimblett live up to not just really his hype, not just his expectations, but truly proving all doubters wrong and beating Michael Chandler the way he did was spectacular to watch. And then seeing Volkanovski, a man who I think is beloved by the MMA community. I don't think there's really much debate on that. Getting his belt back, and that speech he had that, it is a privilege to have adversity because it truly shapes your life. Now I'm kind of paraphrasing, but you get my idea. That speech, God, it was just awesome. Just seeing Volkanovski being able to get his belt back live was something I'm never going to forget. So with that being said, that has been my list of all the pay-per-views, or my ranking of all the pay-per-views this year. If you like the video, like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. And let me know what you think of my list. And let me know how you would rearrange the pay-per-view order. And what was your absolute favorite pay-per-view, or what was the worst pay-per-view in your opinion. But until then, I've been Bo from Brutal Commentary. Stay calm, stay respectful, and enjoy the violence. I'll see y'all next time.